A couple of months ago now, I posted a video essay all on the general thesis of incidental mythology, as well as me as an academic. Our popular culture is our mythology. The video actually didn't do too bad, which I kind of thought that it would. So I thought I'd take a bit of time to give a little bit more detail and complication to the topic. So today, I want to dig into what it actually means to study pop culture as mythology, what we can learn about ourselves through pop culture, and provide a little bit of an example of a type of analysis we can do to our narratives to get at this answer. If you need a primer on the general idea of pop culture narratives as mythology, go check out that previous video, which I'll link in the description below. But for now, let's talk about mythology more generally. As an anthropologist, I understand myths as cultural artifacts. Myths can tell us about people in the same way as looking at other arts can. They are parts of a culture or a society, and as such are reflections of them. So by studying and analyzing myths, we can also get into the heart of the dynamics of the people who tell these stories. One of my preferred ways of digging into pop mythology is through what is called structuralism. Now, when I talk about structuralism in this essay, I'm referring specifically to structural anthropology. Like many things, there's a lot of different forms of structuralism. There's structuralism in linguistics, structuralism in literature, but that being said, structural anthropology is actually inspired by structural linguistics. Structural anthropology was founded by Claude Levi-Strauss. Yes, Levi Strauss. In fact, this Levi Strauss was cousins with the jeans Levi Strauss. But our Levi Strauss was more interested in mythology and anthropology than denim. He saw something familiar in linguistics. Ferdinand de Saussure argued that linguistics should spend less time focused on speech acts and more on the grammar and context. Saussure was one of the ones who established a differentiation between the signifier, i.e. the word, and the signified, or the thing. There was an idea that there was an inherent connection between the word dog and the thing that we call a dog. In other words, there's something doggy about the word dog. Saussure, on the other hand, thought differently. He believed the word dog did not necessarily relate to dog as a thing, but rather as a concept. For anthropology, Levi-Strauss understood that the ways we think about the world is more based on concept and organization of thought than on the things themselves. The way we categorize and think about the things we interact with are not inherent in the things themselves. These things are socially and culturally based, rather than inherently based. As we grow in this world, society tells us what things are and how we should think about them. We look at a dog and we are told it's a dog. But later we see something that's way bigger than that original dog, and it's still a dog. This is something taught to us rather than something we feel inherently. Dogs are obviously an example here, but we can apply this to more complicated conceptions. Instead of dogs, let's think about people. We have people who are like us, and people who are not. And this is also something which is taught. Some people are categorized in different boxes, and some humans are not categorized into the people category at all, depending on the social world you grow up in. An important aspect of this is that the way one culture or society categorizes the things that they meet is not necessarily the same as a different culture or society. This can result in a lot of miscommunication or issues between people, because sometimes we take for granted that these are learned categories rather than inherent categories. There is nothing inherently doggy about the word dog. It's just a word. There is nothing inherently like me that someone else is, but rather aspects which are socially learned and socially labeled. In structural anthropology, we understand these social categories are embedded in a lot of what we do. If this is what our worldview is based on, then the things that we produce are going to also reflect this worldview. This means that a society's mythology also reflects these categories, and by analyzing mythology, we can get a detailed view of what this categorization looks like. So, by analyzing our popular culture, we can understand the society that made that media's form of categorization. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about how we actually go about doing this. First, I'm going to explain how it all works, but then I'm going to actually apply all of this stuff to a piece of pop culture, the first season of Stranger Things. But first, I want to explain a little bit about how we're actually going to do this analysis, so you understand it when we're actually applying it. The structural method starts with finding what are called mythemes. These are the smallest units that make up a myth, inspired by the phoneme in linguistics. Mythemes are the smallest element of a myth, and one that cannot be broken down any further. Each mytheme functions based on relations. Mythemes don't live in isolation. They are directly related to other mythemes, and through this relationship builds the foundation of a myth. Think of this as kind of like any aspect of a story. You can't really just separate something in a story away from everything else in the story. It's understood through its relation to other elements in the story. The structural method is basically like an archaeological excavation, but one through a myth. We start at the uppermost level, the narrative level, which is the most surface level and the most culturally and contextually specific. This is the story, the written, spoken, whatever it is that we are given. Under that is what we call the S3 level, one step removed from the narrative. This level uses the mythemes and element of the myth while understanding their context, and we begin to categorize and understand the relations between these mythemes. And then we get to the S2 level, which is basically the next step abstract. The S2 is as deep as I typically go, and I probably won't even touch on the S2 in this particular video. Levi Strauss believes there to be an S1 level, which he thinks is biologically based. I personally disagree with this, along with a few other structuralists who have come after him, but that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother time. The key elements, the mythemes that we are looking for, are found in narratively significant roles and relationships, which can be found through both action and inaction. For example, silence and noise are both possible mythemes. These can often be represented in a key character, a theme, a location. Once we find a few mythemes, we can look at how they relate to one another and see how they are categorized through their relationships with each other. Essentially, structuralism can be seen as somewhat similar to a textual analysis. The narrative is relegated as a text and is analyzed as one. The point of a structural study, like the one we will be doing on Stranger Things, is not to assess the text as a text, but rather as a cultural artifact that reflects cultural categories. One last thing on the structural study, Levi Strauss's S1 level and his understanding of the biology of myth shows that he truly thought of structure as somehow biologically derived. However, social scientists have since shifted to see a difference between biology and society. This is pretty much like the nature-nurture argument, but in a social sciences context. Essentially, Levi Strauss did not really give enough space for storytellers and actors in society to have any kind of agency. Structure was something that just happened to them, and often unconsciously. However, we can look at societies over time and see how ideas, worldviews, and social ideals can actually change over time. This means that a society's structure can change. We are not the same as we were several hundred years ago. At least I would really hope not. And because of that, I follow the way of some neo-structuralists like Seth Koonin and Jonathan Miles Watson, who have moved beyond the biologically derived aspect to one which is more socially based. This means that there is also more focus given to social agency. I want to give space to the community who tells stories, the writers, the actors, the audience. They each have their own relationship to the text and their own meaning within it. These individuals have an agency over the way that their story is being told, shared, and related to. Okay, so that's all the boring explanation stuff out of the way. So let's show you what this actually looks like through the first season of Stranger Things. We're focusing only on the first season because otherwise this would be a whole book instead of an essay. The first season of Stranger Things is focused around the disappearance of Will Byers, a child from the town of Hawkins. While Sheriff Hopper, Will's friends known as the Party, and his mother and brother hunt for him, the true culprit is a figure from an alternate universe called the Demogorgon, accidentally brought to the town of Hawkins by a local government facility. Here, we can dig into a few major mythemes, including characters, figures, and locations. Let's start with locations. While there are a variety of different set pieces we see throughout the season, including two of the kids' houses, Mike's and Will's, their school, and the government facility, most of the settings can be considered either Hawkins, the village, the town that they are in, or the Upside Down, the name of the alternate universe. Two of the locations are associated with both the village and the Upside Down. Mirkwood, the forest near Hawkins close to where Will lives, and the government laboratory are both locations in some way associated with both the Upside Down and the village itself. Mirkwood is associated with both the Upside Down and Hawkins because it's the location Will disappears, and where Mike's sister Nancy crawls into the Upside Down. Similarly, the government lab is where there are rifts and the ability to create more rifts between the world of Hawkins and the world of the Upside Down. While there are forms of Will's house in the Upside Down, it's not a location in which the transition is possible in quite the same way as it is with Mirkwood and the lab. Mirkwood is an interesting location to consider in the show. The forest is a common symbol and location found in folklore, legends, and myths. In Germanic folklore, as recorded by the Brothers Grimm, the forest was seen as a transformational place, a location in which society's conventions cannot hold. Mirkwood is similar here. It's a location in which people are transformed and moved to new categories and revealed to hold new relations. It's where Will goes missing, and it's also where Nancy has a realization about Will's brother Jonathan and begins to see him in a more positive light. Even though Barbara, the other victim of the Demogorgon, gets taken while at someone's house, the house backs up against the forest, and it's from the forest that the monster comes, so I'll give it. This laboratory, while not a traditional forest, has a similar functioning to the forest. It's a transitory place, a location in which there are transformations in worldview as well as transformations in world. It's the location for physical shifting between Hawkins and the Upside Down, and where Sheriff Hopper first gets a glimpse of the possibilities of the Upside Down, transforming his perspective. The locations in the season are interacted with by the characters, and each character has specific relationships with particular locations. One of the important groups of characters is the party, or Will Byers' friends, Mike, Lucas, and Dustin. The show opens with the group playing Dungeons & Dragons, and the three remaining characters refer to their group dynamics and the game character dynamics even when not playing. Will's family, his brother Jonathan and his mother Joyce, are also characters who are actively working to find Will, at first separate from the friends, but later together. Mike's sister Nancy and her friend Barb begin as separate figures not relating to the missing boy, but become embroiled in it when Barb also goes missing. Sheriff Hopper, an alcoholic, also fights to find the boy. The government officers, primarily that of Dr. Brenner, is an ominous figure in the show and one who frequently hinders the investigation into Will's disappearance or actively hunts the party. 11 is a child found by the party who has mysterious powers and who is actively running away from Dr. Brenner. 11 wishes to help the party find their friend, but is often conflicted about how exactly to go about doing it without potentially harming them or herself. Last is the figure of the Demogorgon, the monster prowling the world and taking individuals. So, now, why don't we categorize these characters based off of their relationship to landscape and location? Most of them are more closely related to the town of Hawkins. They are residents of the town who are happy to embody the quiet middle America town from the 1980s. The characters who fall into this category are the party, Nancy, Jonathan, Joyce, and Sheriff Hopper. Initially, Barb is also in this category, though does not remain there because she gets moved to the Upside Down in a similar way to Will. This leaves Dr. Brenner, the Demogorgon, and 11. These characters are a little more complicated. The only one that is directly associated with one of the locations we have discussed is the Demogorgon, a figure directly from the Upside Down. And even though it moves between Hawkins and the Upside Down, it's primarily associated with the alternate universe. Dr. Brenner is a more complicated figure. While Brenner is not a monster from the Upside Down, he's not really associated with the figures from Hawkins either. Even though there are clearly issues between the characters in the Hawkins category, there is still an inherent community feel to the connections between them. They know each other and understand the connections and contexts of each of the community members, even if they don't really like each other. Brenner, on the other hand, is a very clear outsider, a figure who doesn't belong to the community. That being said, he's still a human, not one from the Upside Down, and therefore wouldn't be suitable to be associated directly with the Upside Down, though the Demogorgon and the relationship between the Upside Down and Hawkins was made due to Brenner's interactions, but we'll save that for a second. 11 is also a figure hard to categorize. Like Brenner, she is not an actual member of the community in Season 1. She's an outsider, and from the same location as Brenner, as she sees Brenner as a parental figure. However, she's not really like Brenner either. She has compassion for those around her and harbors a great fear both towards Brenner and the world of the Upside Down. For now, let's put 11 and Brenner to the side, and we'll think about the type of structure we can sketch out using our other mythemes and their relations before we tackle these two more complicated figures. We have Hawkins and all of its associated characters on one side, and we have the Upside Down and its related characters on the other. Two characters move actively from Hawkins to the Upside Down, Will and Barb. This means that there is what is called a positive correlation between the two categories, as there is room for movement. By positive relation, we mean whether or not there is a combination or possibility for transition, not necessarily based on a value judgment of how the two categories view each other. It's more of a functional understanding rather than a value judgment. So basically, as of right now, we can sketch out our structure as this. The overlapping circles are drawn in order to demonstrate a positive relationship between the two groups, which means that there is possibility of movement. Now, before we go on to thinking about the movement between these categories and how that movement occurs, we first should come back to the two figures that we kind of put to the side. 11 and Dr. Brenner still have no place in our structure. The solution may be to reconsider the naming and considerations of what these categories are. Hawkins and the Upside Down served as viable categories due to demonstrating the relationship between the mythemes of locations and characters. But these locations are themselves mythemes that can be categorized. We can rethink of the Hawkins versus Upside Down as the insiders versus the outsiders. Hawkins is the community of the story, the central group in which there are hierarchies and prejudice, but can recognize threats from the outside world at the same time. If we reconsider the categories as simply in-group versus out-group, rather than Hawkins versus Upside Down, most of the relations stay pretty much the same, with the exception of the addition of Dr. Brenner to the world of the outsiders. This relegation actually makes a bit more sense, as Dr. Brenner is often seen as just as monstrous and scary to the party, and even to Sheriff Hopper, as the Demogorgon is. However, this does not really resolve our issue with 11. 11 is initially an outsider to the community, yes, and viewed with suspicion from several members of the party. However, as time progresses, and 11 demonstrates her willingness to help the community and her wanting to be part of the loving friend group she finds herself in, the community gathers around her to protect her. However, her appearance not fitting with typical styling of female children of the time, and her reluctance and difficulty in speaking, still very much paints her regularly as an other. 11 is a complicated figure because she is both of the inside and the outside at the same time. Like the Demogorgon, she has the ability to maneuver through and between categories, and is simultaneously fitting into both categories, while not really fully belonging to either. 11 is therefore what we call a mediator, a figure which exists between categories and can at times facilitate the movements between. She is also able to traverse aspects of the Upside Down in order to find Will and Barb. While she has difficulty bringing Will back, she is still able to traverse enough to find out if he is still alive and where he is. However, I would venture to add an addition to this mediating figures, and that's the Demogorgon. I know we associate the Demogorgon with the Upside Down and the outside category. However, like 11, the Demogorgon travels. While it is mostly associated with the Upside Down, it is also a figure which moves categories and moves others through categories, traveling to the in-group to prey upon the individuals there. It is not just a figure which remains in the Upside Down, but one which moves, and seemingly with agency. Levi Strauss's understanding of myth is that myth moves from establishing an awareness of oppositions and progressing towards their resolution. For Stranger Things, we have two categorical problems to resolve: the mediatory figures of the Demogorgon and 11. The problem of the Demogorgon is solved with its death. The problem of 11 is more complicated. It is evident 11 is not fully able to settle in the worlds of the inside/Hawkins because of her extraordinary abilities. So her separation is resolved by a feigning of death, though one that is left as potentially open at the end of the series when Sheriff Hopper is seen leaving 11's favorite food of Egos at her supposed gravesite. And one which is, by the way, in Mirkwood. In order to understand what Stranger Things is saying about fear, and what to fear, we should first consider the context of Stranger Things. The show takes place in Middle America in the 1980s. The show replicates filming aspects of the era, and even draws on popular films of the time, such as Jaws and E.T. However, despite drawing on the 1980s, the myth of Stranger Things is a reflection of the time period it was written and produced, around 2016. That being said, there is a lot of similarities between the United States at the time the show is set and at the time it was made, which is a reflection in the way the structure of the show is understood and reflected. First, we should talk about the nature of a monster. In Jeffrey Cohen's 7 Theses of Monster Studies, one of the ways a monster is understood is as a harbinger of categorical crisis. Structuralism can demonstrate this type of monster really well, as it functions on the understanding of categories and finding elements which do not necessarily fit these categories. Our two primary figures who do not fully fit into categories neatly and cleanly are 11 and the Demogorgon, both of whom are viewed as monstrous throughout the show. 11 is consistently viewed as monstrous from those who are more related to the government agency, which also includes quote-unquote patriotic adults who follow the government's figure's orders regardless of what it means more solidly for the other characters involved. 11 is a tool, a thing to be used in the same way the Demogorgon is. On the other hand, some characters do not see 11 as a monster, but only as a mediatory figure who is more vulnerable than terrible. Sheriff Hopper in particular views 11 as a sympathetic figure to be protected alongside the town, rather than a figure to be despised and rejected. Stephen Prince notes that the United States of today is, quote, an extremely conservative nation, end quote, and that its attention on right-wing policies began in the 80s. Ronald Reagan-era America is being reflected in Trump's America, as noted by Trump's insistence on making America great again, a slogan actually used by Reagan in his 1980s presidential campaign. It is precisely this xenophobia and racism that Stranger Things seeks to alter. When the show is beginning to get closer to hitting its climax, the town of Hawkins is not being run over by supernatural forces like 11, but rather the government. The government sees 11 as a test subject, one that needs to be controlled or neutralized. Despite this, the mediatory figure of 11 does not act as a monster for the other characters of the show, but rather as a unifying force, and one that connects others to the central aim of the show, to save a child. The structure of Stranger Things, as painted in our structure, can be understood in two different ways depending on the characters in question. For the government figures and the patriotic adults, primarily noted by Mike's father who claims himself a patriot to the government officials in his home, the maintenance of the structure should come at the destruction of those who are not, quote-unquote, like us. This is seen in their treatment of 11 as something needing controlling and neutralizing. 11 is a social other, one who is not seen as vulnerable and fleeing persecution and brutality, but rather as a monster that threatens the society she comes to. On the other hand, there are characters who have different viewpoints. Sheriff Hopper, for example, sees 11 as vulnerable and marginalized. He sees the same for Will Byers, a child from a low-income home whose disappearance does not seem to really be fazing the town. In fact, there is a level of consideration regarding homophobia in regards to Will Byers as well, where those in the LGBT+ community as social others are not seen as worthy of protection. When the police are questioning Joyce on her missing son, she comments he had few friends and was bullied a lot for people thinking he was quote-unquote queer. The police interject and ask, "And is he?" To which Joyce responds, "That does not really matter. He's missing."
He's a sensitive kid. Lonnie used to say he was queer, called him a fag.
Is he?
He's missing, is what he is.
This interaction shows that the social construction of society and what is involved in the in-group and what's involved in the out-group of Hawkins in the structure are more controlled for some in the society than for others. This shifting is not necessarily a shifting of structure, but rather of interpretation of structure. For Sheriff Hopper and the party, 11 is still a transitory figure, one who is both inside and outside the community at the same time. This aspect of the structure does not change from character to character, but rather it's the perspective on the figure who is mediatory which does. While some view her as monsters, others see her as vulnerable. Anthropologist Seth Koonin demonstrates how structure can change over time, typically from a privileging of some elements of the structure over others. Some elements are emphasized and others de-emphasized depending on the needs of the individual and the goal to achieve. This means structure is not necessarily as biologically derived as Levi Strauss suggested. The agency given to storytellers means that individuals or group of individuals can work to try and change the structure of the societies they are a part of. This is what eventually leads to revolutions, or other alterations of worldview over time. For Stranger Things, they push for the monster to not be considered as monstrous because of its inability to fit into normal society. In fact, the great fights in the show are not necessarily between the monsters, either 11 or the Demogorgon, and the town of Hawkins. The revolutionary figures are the primary fighters in the show, the children bullied because they are nerds and friends with a queer, the outcast and low-income buyers, and the alcoholic and distrusted sheriff. These are the individuals who take up arms, not against the monster, but against the government and the forces that seek to continue to persecute the vulnerable. At the Screen Actors Guild Awards in January of 2017, Stranger Things won the award for Outstanding Performance by an Ensemble in a Drama Series. Upon accepting the award, David Harbour, the actor who plays Sheriff Hopper, said this:
"Is a call to arms from our fellow craftsmen and women to go deeper, and through our art to battle against fear, self-centeredness, and exclusivity of our predominantly narcissistic culture, and through our craft to cultivate a more empathetic and understanding society by revealing intimate truths that serve as a forceful reminder to folks that when they feel broken and afraid and tired, they are not alone. We are united in that we are all human beings and we are all together on this horrible, painful, joyous, exciting, and mysterious ride that is being alive. Now, as we act in the continuing narrative of Stranger Things, we 1983 Midwesterners will repel bullies. We will shelter freaks and outcasts, those who have no homes. We will get past the lies. We will hunt monsters. And when we are at a loss amidst the hypocrisy and the casual violence of certain individuals and institutions, we will, as per Chief Jim Hopper, punch some people in the face when they seek to destroy the meek and the disenfranchised and the marginalized. And we will do it all with soul, with heart, and with joy. We thank you for this responsibility. Thank you.
David Harbour's speech demonstrates the resistance given to storytellers who reject the nature of some aspects of cultural structure given to them. The shifting nature of fear is not due to outside forces, but rather are formed to resist the notion of a culture telling us who to fear when we reject such forces entirely. It is a different perspective on a structure, one which sees most transitory figures as monstrous. Instead, these people privilege a different understanding, one where the vulnerable are supported, and the monsters are those who monstricize the vulnerable. In other words, it's attempting to change the cultural worldview the show is brought into, one to change the perspective on our structure and to bring fear to those telling us to ostracize the vulnerable, and to protect those who are caught in between. So that's structuralism, and one that is applied to Stranger Things, where we can learn a lot more about not necessarily just what Stranger Things is saying, but exactly how it's trying to change the cultural world that it was brought into and created from.